The throne room smelled of old smoke and oiled metal, a scorched perfume that clung to the iron steps like rot to a wound. The blades that made the throne drank the light and gave none back. Close up, they were not a legend but a mess. Rust-pitted, notched, some bent like bad teeth, slick in places where the damp crept and would not leave. Jaime stood with his hand on his sword hilt and watched the doors. The hammering at the far end of the hall, like the heartbeat of a dying giant. The boy's white cloak dragged behind him, heavy as a verdict. He had stopped thinking of it as cloth. On certain days it felt like a chain that someone else had looped around his shoulders, and today it pulled harder than iron. The king perched above like a gaunt spider fattened on ash. Aerys's hair was a filmy cloud about his shoulders, gray where it had been silver, matted where a hand had worried it too often. The mouth worked and muttered even when no words came. His fingers were stained dark at the nails. He did not seem to blink. His eyes were bright with the wrong kind of light. "Listen," he said, and cocked his head as if the hall were a shell he held to his ear. "Do you hear them? My good friend at the gates. Lannisport has a long memory, and so does Casterly Rock. He has come to kneel, you'll see." Then the eunuch drifted half a pace closer to the dais. "Your Grace, it is more prudent to receive Lord Tywin within Maegor's holdfast. The Red Keep is strong, but the holdfast is stronger. The prince is dead, the river lords have taken the roads, and..." Aerys bared his teeth. "Prudent? You counsel prudence to me?" He laughed, a dry rasp. "You waddle on your soft feet and whisper fear. I have dragons yet. I have good friends yet. I have fire." His gaze slid down and snagged on Jaime as a hook might catch a tunny's jaw. "Sir, you were sworn to me, to guard your Grace's life with mine," Jaime said. The words had been taught to his tongue before he was grown. They spilled without effort now, the rhythm well worn. He forced his hand from the hilt. It wanted to curl and never uncurl. "And I will." "Then watch," Aerys said, and lifted his chin. "Watch and be witness when my friend makes amends." Pycelle shuffled forward, rank, with the sour medicinal smell of old men and locked cabinets. The chain about his neck was bright as coin. "The bells have been rung, your Grace. The gates are being opened. Lord Tywin bears gifts for his king." "Open the gates," Aerys said. "Open them wide. The lion is proud. He should not be kept waiting." The hammering grew louder, a rhythm within a rhythm, and with it, the voices. They were faint, a sea surf hiss beyond the thick doors. The chant of 3,000 throats mingled with the clatter of hooves and the crack of whips. The eunuch's face did not move, but the eyes moved enough for Jaime to see. The man was measuring distances, door to dais to back stair, calculating without numbers. The alchemist had already taken his leave and left a ghost of sweet, acrid reek behind. The smell that made men think of summer thunder, and some, if they had sense, think of graves. Wisdom Rossart had been pale and quiet, with a clerk's hands and a fanatic's self-forgetting. His mouth had shaped the word readiness, as if he meant prayer by it. Jaime had not stopped him. The chain chafed. "If the king lives, you are sworn. If the king orders, you obey. You are 19, and you have not yet learned how to be two men at once. One who knows what is right, and one who does what he swore. The lesson will be taught whether you consent or not." The first horn sounded below the hill, a long, low organ note that vibrated the air in the hall. The second joined it, and then the third. And the doors shivered on their bars as if the sound alone could batter them down. Through the narrow eastern windows, the city spread dully, blunted under a sky the color of wet wool. It had rained in the night, and the roofs were dark as shaved heads. Smoke from 100 cookfires had not yet risen to a proper plume. Horses blew steam and stamped iron on stone. The bells of Baelor's sept tolled slow as prayer. The white sword of the Kingsguard was absent. The best of the white cloaks had gone where the prince had sent them, far from the capital. The old lord with the granite face sat where no one could call him back. The sword of the morning was lost to the city and would not come. Barristan had bled his honor into the trident and lay with a healer's hands prodding him like fruit in a market stall. In the throne room, There was only the boy who had been made a knight to please a king's spite. The white cloak settled with a sigh when he breathed, as if the cloth itself mistrusted him. "You should go to the holdfast, your grace," Jaime said, and hated the piety in his own voice. "The Red Keep is not what it was. There are passages. There are—" "Sir," Eris said, and the word had a whip crack in it. "You forget yourself. I will sit my throne." Jaime shut his mouth. The eunuch's mouth made nothing at all. Pycelle huffed and stroked his beard, a foghorn of disapproval that had stood the test of 2 reigns. The guards at the doors exchanged a look and chose their duty like gamblers picking a dice cup. The doors groaned and peeled back. The great hall's breath was sucked out and then returned with the roar of a city fed into a funnel. Banners crowded the courtyard, red velvet in a forest of ash-silver spears, lions' heads tolerably done by a dozen different hands. The Lannister men chanted as if their throats were one throat. Gold helms flashed. The first ranks marched smooth as poured grain. The ones behind looked like men who had slept in their mail. They smelled of field and field latrine and old bread. Tywin's banner towered above them, heavy with embroidery and meaning. There was an instant of misleading beauty, order, color, the clean geometry of a column moving into shadow. Then it broke as all beautiful things break. The red tide stuttered. It bulged and pressed, and then a rip ran through it. Swords winked that had not winked before. A woman's scream stabbed, startlingly pure, as if it had escaped from a different world and would be drawn back any moment. The Lannister men were in among the king's men. Shoulder to shoulder and then throat to throat. And Jaime could not tell from his place who struck the first unambiguous treason. He knew the truth of it, though. The lion had come to kneel and had remembered his name at the threshold. The city had opened its mouth to be fed, and the hand had jammed teeth in. It was too late for prudence, too late for the holdfast. He felt the instant pass, the doorway in time through which a better counsel might have slipped, and knew it had closed. "Ah," Eris said softly behind him, and the sound was not sorrow. "So, call my hand." The king's fingers dug into the arms of his seat. "Fetch wisdom, Rossart." Lord Hand, where is my hand? Go and find him, sir. Bid him light the city. Bid him make me a crown of light." "I can send a man," Pycelle began, flustered, and then choked on the rest because the eunuch had already dipped his head and flowed away. Jaime moved without knowing he had moved. The white cloak whispered after him as he took the side stair, 2 at a time, his palm sliding on the banister's polish. He told himself he meant to intercept the alchemist before he reached the vaults. He told himself he would place a hand on a shoulder and say a command that could not be gainsaid by authority or by the simple weight of a mailed hand. He did not tell himself what he would do if that hand shook off his touch. The passages of the Red Keep were a net the king had slung across his hill, meant to catch enemies and secrets alike. Jaime had learned corners and intersections as some boys learned river tracks. His feet remembered for him and turned where thinking would have made him slow. He passed a guardrobe where the stink was prodigious, a guardroom where 2 men blinked at him stupidly, as if the white cloak made him invisible, a chapel where the candles had run to stumps and left a mottled wax map of old devotions. The air in the lower passages grew cooler, then colder, then took on the alchemist's sweetness. He met a boy running uphill with eyes round as coins and a wet smear on one cheek that might have been someone else's blood. He seized the boy's shoulder, and the boy fell to his knees and hid his face in home-worn hands. Jaime left him there. He found Rossart at the mouth of a hypogeum, where the old stones sweated green on green. The hand turned with all the speed of a man who had already yielded himself to ritual. There was a staff in his left hand, looped at the end with a wick that guttered and flared, eating oil. There were 2 acolytes behind him with little lanterns, neat and frightened, proper in their fear. The hand smelled of almonds and bad dreams. "Lord Hand," Jaime said, and the courtesy knifed between them like a joke. "Say you are not going where I think you go." Rossart's eyelids flickered. The eyes within were not fanatical exactly. He had the look of men who have swallowed a story that explains everything. and are calmer for it. The hour has come, he said, steady as a sexton reciting litany. The city is a hearth, he added, and almost smiled. Coal and tinder, tinder and coal. Do you wish to stop us, sir? Yes, Jaime said. Then kill me, Rossart said, and made no move to defend himself. There it was, tight and diamond hard and correct, like something out of a training yard treatise. Kill the hand and the chain of the order falls slack. Kill the hand and the boy in the white cloak does what is necessary while still telling himself a story about vows. Jaime's fingers tightened on his hilt until they ached in the joints. The leather had warmed to his palm. He could draw within a breath. He could cut within two. He could make it clean. You will burn children, he said instead, and was ashamed that his voice was not the voice he used when he gave orders in the yard. You will burn old men and midwives and His Grace commands, Rossart said. The words were not pious. They were flat as ledger work. When a head commands, the hands obey. When fire is laid, it is lit. There is no mystery. The boy in the white cloak could have blamed the evil on the old. He could have risked no blame at all, drawn steel, and made the hallway bright for an instant, and then dark again. He had done killing in narrow ways at narrow range. He knew how long it took to open a throat. He was 19, and still believed that the geometry of an action could make the morality of it. Somewhere above them, metal rang on metal, the blunt clang of shields and the sharper notes of blades. A woman screamed again, closer, human. He saw a flash of his father's face as it looked in candlelight, composed, irritable at stupidity, shrewd to a hair. He had never seen his father's face in fear. Go back, he told the hand, and put his body in the way because his body was the tool he had proved most useful. Go back and tell him there is no need. Tell him the lions kneel. Tell him 1,000 invented stories. Tell him anything at all, but do not go down there. The acolytes, hemmed by corridor and duty, looked at Rossart with the helpless hope of puppies. For an instant, Rossart's mouth trembled, not with fear but with impatience. A man interrupted at delicate work. The king commands, he said again, and motioned with the staff. One of the boys lifted his lantern, and the hand moved to pass. Jaime caught the staff. It was absurd, this wrestle in a corridor under the Capitol. While armies contended, and a dynasty pitched one way, and then the other like a carriage on a broken wheel. The hand did not let go. The wick fluttered and spat and licked at the oil. The acolyte yelped and fell back. Jaime could have drawn his sword, still could, always could, but he tightened both hands on the staff and hauled. They moved together, foot skidding on the ancient stones. The wick swung bright and mad, threw wild shadows and wild light on 3 men in an alley of damp rock playing at who would be remembered. Jaime twisted and the staff came away. Rossart let out his breath as if someone had loosened his stays. He should have done it then. One clean blow, either way, either to end the man or to shatter the wick and grind it under his heel. Instead, he stood foolishly with a piece of another man's purpose in his hands, and the roar started. It was not the roar of a single pot or a single cellar. It was the inhalation of a beast, the size of the hill, taking its first breath. The air in the passage moved against their faces and then back again. Rossart did not smile, but his eyes softened. A father seeing a cradle rock. The first green heave came from the west, under the old granaries and the fish market where scales stuck to the boards in shining armor. Jaime did not see the flame. He felt it in his bones like an organ note that did not belong in a human church. The second rose under the street of flour and put a lace of emerald fire up the poured slope and along the gutters, so that for a breath, the city looked as if it had been drawn with a new hand. It traveled as water travels when the ground is right for it. The third lifted somewhere under Baylor's sept, and the bells that had been tolling became incoherent, and then went out as the rope burned from the hands that held it. The fourth. It was stupid. The counting was stupid. There was no counting to be done. Took a row of houses and a cooper's yard, and a stable with 12 good horses in it, and the green ate the brown and the black, and left things a kind of lighter black that was not a color so much as fatigue. Rossart made a small sound, a prayer or a sigh. It takes so politely, he murmured. See how it eats what is offered, and asks nothing. It is a tidy thing. There will be no plague after. The rats will all be—" Jaime shoved him. He did not do it to be cruel, and chose not to kill. He was merely a man in a narrow place trying to get by. Rossart fell against the passage wall with a muffled grunt, and one of the acolytes exclaimed as if someone had put a foot on a dog's tail. Jaime turned and ran. The air turned full of taste. The sweet bitter almond of the thing the alchemists tended, and something else under it that made his teeth ache. He counted passages by memory and not by eye. The light made eyes foolish. He surfaced in a gallery above the throne room, the smell advancing in a green tide that did not need to be seen to be known. The hall below looked somehow smaller with the king sitting where he had sat before. Pycelle had fled at last. The eunuch was nowhere. The side doors stood ajar, crooked like bad teeth in a wide mouth. The king's fingers had worked blood from a hangnail. It shone dark as polish on the arm of the throne. "There," Ares said softly, as a man might when he shows a friend a new garden. "There, there." His voice had gone thin as a reed. "Sir, you should look. Come, boy, look what was promised. My city in flower." Jaime came down the steps, one hand gliding over cold iron. The white cloak dragged. He had never felt the weight of what it meant to be a witness. He had lied to himself about courage, told himself it had a pleasing taste. This did not taste of courage. This tasted like guilt. He looked. The city was a pattern, a map of an old man's mind, and now a map of an old man's madness. The fire took in channels, ran along gutters, sprang up in seams where boards met with pitch between them, lifted from trapdoors where someone had thought to hide and hid only fuel. It found stores of old brush and old fish oil, old cloth, old wine stains in the cellars. It climbed ropes. It took curtains like gossip. It blew itself in green veils from the mouths of drains that had been cut in ages when kings wore other names. Where it found stone, it flattered it. Where it found flesh, it loved it better. For an instant, before the smoke sulked up and hid them, he saw people's faces in the slats of alleyways, staring, dazzled, beautiful because astonished. When their mouths opened to speak, the smoke went in. It was better not to imagine the words. He had never seen fire that moved with intention. He had seen men move with intention. It was something like that. He did not know where his father was. He knew where his father would wish to be, and where he would contrive to be when contriving mattered. A part of him, small and stale, thought, will the story say it was Tywin's fault? Will the story say the lion came with a torch? It was an irrelevant part and cruel. He had his king. He had his vow. He put his eyes back in his head and looked away from Green. Majesty, he said, because ceremony knits small things to big and makes a rope out of them. We must go. Go, Eris said dreamily. Go where, sir? There is nowhere now but here. The city has been purified. We will build again. We will build all in black stone and never let the rats come in. They came through the walls in their fur and their trezons. But the fire knows them. The fire hates them. He laughed, which was terrible. He will kneel, he added. And Jaime could not tell if he was Tywin, or the Storm Lord in the west, or the son who would not come home. They will all kneel. Bring me my court. Bring me new knights. Bring me the holdfast, Jaime said gently, as if he were coaxing a child from a high ledge. There are doors there that will not burn. The holdfast, Eris mimicked, and worked his mouth as if a bone were caught in it. I am the fast. I am the hold. He stared at Jaime, and for a beat of the heart the eyes were young, the man in them perfectly capable of saying sense. Why do you look at me like that, boy? Your father betrayed me. The sense went. You would not betray me. No, Jaime said, and knew it for the first plain lie he had spoken since he took the white. He put his hand on the arm of the throne, not on the king. He did not want to touch him. The iron was not clean. He heard the red keep take a blow below them, or felt it. Stone transmitted the language of assault, blunt and true. The Lannister men were within. The lion had many claws, and they did not all glitter. One of them was a towering brute of a man who had never cared for the taste of orders, unless they were blood-salted. Jaime thought of him and put the thought away as if it were a bad knife. He did not want to imagine those hands in this hall. There were children in the keep. A baker's boy who carried water, a seamstress girl who mended the queen's cloth no one used anymore, a rat boy who knew every passage and would be tempted to try them all. He did not think about the lady who had left her homeland for this city and gone to an island because her womb would not abide another child without destroying her. He thought about his sister once and then carefully did not again. "Sir," said a voice at his shoulder, respectful but hard with breath. "We have to move him." They had come up from some passage he had forgotten he knew. 4 of the gold cloaks stood with helms askew and blood up to the knuckles. They were not men of any special loyalty, but they knew what a living king was worth on a day like this, more than a dead one, at least for long enough to hand him like coin to a man who might count it a debt. They were here because they were brave enough or stupid enough. 2 took the king under the arms. Eris shrieked when their hands touched him, high and thin and womanish. And then Claude. He scratched one man across the face and left bloody furrows. The man swore without flinching. They dragged the king. He writhed and spat. "Gently," Jaime said, though there was no gently to be had. Eris kicked like a child. He was not heavy. He had eaten little for days. They took him through the side door, down the narrower stair hung with moth-eaten black. Smoke had learned the stair too, or had always known it, and came up in thin gray sheets. Eris coughed until he gagged. The gold cloaks swore about their eyes and kept their grips. The passage at the bottom opened towards the holdfast and towards the kitchens. They chose the holdfast. The kitchens would be a kiln by now. The bars on the holdfast door were old and stiff. 2 of the men set their shoulders to them while the third tugged and the last looked back along the passage and saw what came. It was red at first, not green, because it was men. They had seen the hall, no doubt, and smelled blood in it, and were darting along the corridors like hunting cats. Jaime saw a glint of gilding on a pauldron and recognized his father's taste. He stepped forward and his sword snicked free and was promise and fact in his hand. The white cloak moved about his legs with a life that was less simple than wind. "Hold," he said. He was not loud, but the men heard. It is an odd trick men have. They know when a thing said will be obeyed and are cautious of ignoring it. "By His Grace's warrant," Jaime added, because naming a thing puts a rope on it, and men feel ropes even when they pretend they do not. They came on slower. Their chief was a big man with pale eyes and no patience. He took in the white cloak, the crownless, blood-flecked king struggling in 2 men's arms, the iron bars they had not yet lifted. The easy grace of the boy with the pretty hair and the good blade. The big man swung his own sword once, as if to limber his shoulder. "Out of the way," he said. "No," Jaime said. They had the length of a half-dozen heartbeats to choose how this story would be told later. The big man decided one way. He lifted his sword. Another man behind him hissed and reached for his arm as if to warn or restrain, or merely share the blame. Jaime did not see which. He went to meet the blade, and for a moment time ceased to be a river, and became a pond with stones breaking it. The first stone fell. The first blow rang a true note that had nothing to do with words. Jaime was good. There are men who are brave, and men who are deft, and men who are both. It is a prosperous place to stand when you are 19, and your limbs are fluid. He caught the big man's stroke near the cross and slid his own blade down, seeking tendon, seeking a place where armor made a promise it could not keep. The big man grunted and turned the bite with mail and muscle. Jaime stepped left, because the corridor was narrower than it looked, and felt the wall like a cold shoulder. He heard the third gold cloak behind him at the bars, breathing like a dog that has run too far too fast. The king sobbed once. The green light pulsed, and then dropped, and then pulsed again, and the men in the passage all became shadows with wet eyes. They fought in a place made for kitchens and council, where a queen's servant had undone buckles, and a drunk had lain down once and woken alone. The floor had been sanded to a dull gloss by the feet of generations of people who had never thought of their feet again once they left a room. Now it gritted under boot heel, because someone had broken a lamp there an hour ago. Jaime's mind noticed this and put it away and moved his hands. He had always liked swords because they insisted on the present tense. You did not reminisce with a blade. You conversed. The big man said, I am strong, and I need little more than strength. Jaime answered, I am clever and quick, and I have been taught by men who did not waste time teaching fools. The big man's sword grazed the white cloak, and it smoked for an instant and smelled like hair burned in a candle. The green had crept here too. Jaime struck and heard someone cry out, not the big man. Blood makes a distinct sound when it leaves a body. He stepped in and lifted, and the big man's blade kissed the ceiling and stuck for an instant. A lover turned aside. Now, someone said, who might have been Jaime himself, and the bars jerked and the holdfast gave, an old hinge deciding at last that it was tired. The gold cloaks hauled the king through. Jaime slid backwards, the big man's sword scraping at his breastplate, and then reached the threshold and turned and ran. It is cowardice to run too soon. It is stupidity to run too late. He had learned this in another corridor years ago with a wooden blade and a man laughing at him. He did not intend to relearn it when the laugh would not be kind. The holdfast swallowed them. The men barred the door with a crash, and then two more, and then stood with their hands on the wood as if they could hold a city out by will. It almost worked. The pounding outside became the noise of a man who has fallen down the stairs and will not admit it. Someone screamed once and then screamed less. The room within was spare and bleak and full of old spider wrappings where no one had bothered to sweep for a winter. Eris slid down the wall to the floor like a spill. His hair stuck to his cheeks. His eyes turned in his head, and he put his hand to his mouth like a boy who does not wish to vomit in front of his elders. Jaime knelt because he could not think what else to do. The sword lay on the floor beside him and looked like a thing someone else had left there. Green light crawled at the edges of the narrow windows, not steady. The holdfast was stone to its heart. The fire licked it and came away unsatisfied. It would find satisfaction elsewhere. Water, Jaime said, and the smallest of the gold cloaks ran for a jug and found none and came back with a pitcher of small beer that tasted gone to vinegar. Eris sipped and spat and swore, and then drank because his body insisted. The beer ran down his chin and made a map on his bony throat. Majesty, Jaime said again, and heard the absurdity of the word in this room. We will keep you here until the fighting. He did not finish, because the fighting did not end, and because there were too many endings possible, and only a few of them were survivable for a man with a crown. Eris's eyes settled. For a breath he looked almost like a man who had led armies from a saddle, and judged disputes about ditches and tithes, and had known a time when his wife would touch his hand without flinching. Time is crueler than any enemy when it rots a mind first and leaves the face a mask. He coughed and wiped his mouth and looked at Jaime, and when he spoke the old voice came up through the rust like a spring through stone. You will not leave me, he said, and it was not a question. No, Jaime said, and let the strand of steel that ran through the word pull his spine straight. I will not leave you. The king stared at him a long moment. Wet from the eyes ran down the strakes of his cheeks. They betray me, he whispered, and then a laugh bubbled up that was not the old voice at all. They burn so prettily, it eats them. Look at it eat them. The laugh shook his body until the gold cloak holding his arm glanced away, uneasy. The beating on the door grew methodical, not the first wild rush, but a man with a mind at work. The lintel trembled. Dust sifted. Somewhere in the stone a crack like a hairline line drew itself where none had been. Green light glowed and paled, glowed and paled. It is not recorded in songs how long men stand in small rooms on bad days. The greens and the grays all become one color, and then a different one. Time does not run like a harpist's fingers across strings in such places. It drips. The men took turns at the bars, and then did not because there was nothing to be done but put all the arms one had to a thing, and lean. The king shivered, like a dog. Jaime breathed and counted to keep his hands steady, and then lost the count and started again. The door became a fact composed of smaller facts. A stain of old oil like a man's profile, a nail that had gone rusty at the head, and not at the shank, a knot in the wood like an eye that watched without judging. It is good for men to learn what a door is in such detail. It reminds them that a door is only wood and can be reduced to wood again by labor. The door moved inward a finger's breadth, and the big man's laugh blew through like stink. "Open up," he called in a voice that might have been merry at a feast. "The king's friends are here." Jaime stood. He took his sword from the floor because he had set it down. The white cloak brushed his heels. It had been white once to someone. It would be white again if someone beat it on a stone and bleached it with lye and sun. For the moment it was gray and smelled like other men's fear. He did not think of his father. That effort, at least, he could make and keep. He thought about the precise place his blade would need to be if the door opened so far, and he had this much step to give, and the man outside had that much arm. He thought about weight and angle and the height of the lintel. He thought about his vow, which had once seemed like a garment that would make him nobler, and now sat on his shoulders like damp wool. The door buckled. The first plank split with a sound like lightning going sideways. The big man laughed again, and another voice, less sure, less amused, said his name as if to warn him. The big man said the name of a mother in reply, with disrespect. The second plank cracked. A spearhead slid in and made a little circle as if searching for a belly. The gold cloak to Jaime's left kicked the shaft with his heel and the spear withdrew. The king made a sound like a rabbit caught under a snare. It was a scene from a tale a nurse might tell a child to scare him into obedience. Men in a strong room with a monster at the door. Jaime had never listened well as a child. He intended to do a better job now. He steadied his blade. He drew his breath slow, as he had been taught under a summer sky, and found the summer in his lungs even in this room where the city burned and the world had been misnamed. The wood went. The big man came a step into the breach, shoulders filling it like a boulder rolled into a cave mouth. His hair was pale as straw left out too long. His teeth showed. In the green light they looked like something in a midden. He saw the king, and hunger came onto his face like a revelation. He lifted his sword as a priest might lift a book. "No," Jaime said again, and the word was a thing in his hand. He moved. Later, when men who had not been there told the story to men who would never go to such rooms, they would speak of swiftness and surety and cleverness, because those were virtues men liked in tales. They would not speak about how close the shaft of the spear came to a man's thigh, or the way the big man's breath smelled, or the wet squeak leather makes when sweat has soaked it, or the single absurd thought that traveled across the mind of a 19-year-old knight as he stepped into the measure. That if he lived, he would never again drink small beer in a guardroom without tasting vinegar and smoke. The blades met like two bells struck at once. The sound should have been beautiful. It was not. It was the end of something and the start of something worse. Jaime turned his wrists and leaned his weight and saw, in the corner of his sight, the king's thin hands clutching at the stone at his back. Fingers spidered. He knew, as men know the shape of their own mouths without a looking glass, that he could end a reign with a single motion if he chose. He did not choose. He did the thing he had sworn to do. He became his vow. Outside, the green light climbed the sky, and the city exhaled. The bells of the sept were gone, but a bell somewhere else. A little parish bell, perhaps, down near the mud gate where the fishwives gossiped, had been spared and rang as if a child were pulling its rope with both hands, not knowing any better thing to do. The sound stumbled through the smoke and came to the holdfast. A thin music. It sounded like a world refusing, doggedly, to be simple. The door opened wider. The big man pressed. Jaime yielded a step and took another back toward his king, who stood suddenly upright as if memory had propped him. Perhaps he remembered a father's hand on his shoulder from a younger day. Perhaps he remembered nothing at all but the feel of stone under his fingers. Smoke curled and made thoughts slow. It gave the room the taste of old coins and ruined suppers. The world narrowed to the wet gleam on the big man's blade, the grain in the plank beside his head, the place where his own boot sole nearly slipped on beer, and the heat at his back that was not the heat of fire, but the heat of a body and a crown and the wrong kind of light. He fought. He held. He did not kill his king. The night outside turned green as spring and then black as pitch, and then green again, in pulses, as if some enormous heart beneath the hill had decided at last to beat. He felt each thud in his bones. He let it tell him the measure. He thought of nothing else. The room was only a room, and his oath, which had always been good at keeping company with lies, for once sat straight and unadorned in his chest, and did not argue with him. It was a bad night for making arguments. At last the men outside stopped pressing, not because they had come to love their king, but because there was a calculus in it. They would break the door by and by. They knew it. He knew it. In the meantime, elsewhere in the keep, other doors could be broken, other bargains made, other children silenced, other men offered and accepted. The big man smiled a last fat smile, and withdrew a pace and set his shoulder again, and the men behind him set themselves as men do when they mean to finish a thing. The gold cloaks propped the bar and leaned and prayed in their private ways. Some with words, one with a little rhythm tapped against his knee, one by repeating the names of his children as if to conjure them between himself and harm. Jaime stood in the center of the room because that was where a man with a blade belongs when he wears a white cloak and the room holds a king. He stood there a while. The bells of the little parish near the mud gate talked to themselves and then fell silent, not because anyone told them to, but because the rope had burned through, or the bell ringer had fallen, or the tower had sighed and moved a little in an old joint. The green light lessened. Smoke thickened. Somewhere beneath the keep, a set of jars had found nothing but sodden stone and had gone out with a rude hiss, leaving a smell like a blacksmith's yard after rain. Somewhere else, a street had gone up as if it had been waiting its whole life for this and was grateful to be called at last. It was not a single story. No story is when cities are involved. In the first blue of almost dawn, if dawn could be said to belong to days like this, Jaime heard a new sound. It was not like the laughter of the big man or the bells, or the breath-sawing of men who had run too hard in mail. It was a careful tread, a measured order shouted in a lower voice. A thinning of the press, as if new minds had come into the old plan. He felt it before he could name it. A change of grammar in the assault. Those who led the Lion's Men had come up, or had merely taken control. It meant neither mercy nor doom by itself. It meant calculation. "Sir," one of the gold cloaks whispered, and lifted his chin at the door. Jaime nodded, and did not move his gaze from the breach. A voice came. Not the big man's and not a fool's. "Sir Jaime," it said, taking the courtesy as if it were a coin and testing it against its teeth. "Open. It grows hot elsewhere. We have business with your master." Jaime said nothing. "Open," the voice repeated, patient, well-bred, with the faintest thread of something iron through it. "Or be opened." Jaime looked at the king. Eris crouched with his knees drawn up like a boy too young for a long journey. His hair was chalky with the dust that had sifted down all night. He blinked and licked his lips. "Sir," he whispered in the old voice, "do not let them take me." "No," Jaime said, "because there are days when men must be made simple." He turned and set his feet. The white cloak brushed the stone and left a mark. The door heaved breathtakingly in and burst. Not clean, not in a tail-like way, but in a groaning, splintering surrender that recalled all the days it had shut on minor things and held them out, and now could not be asked to do a little more. Men came through, orderly, at a crouch that made them smaller targets. They were armed well. Their eyes had no story in them. They were there to do what it was the day's work to do. Behind them was a man in gilded half-armor, practical, polished, with a face Jaime knew as he knew the face in his shaving glass. Not because it was the same, but because it had been there all his life when shadows were long and meals came under cloches, and the word no was a piece of furniture. His father looked at him and did not at once look at the king. For a breath, the Red Keep was quiet enough for a boy in the holdfast to imagine that none of it had happened. Motes drifted in a small beam of light where the stone had allowed a crack, and would soon allow a trickle, and if the masons were not called, a spill, and then a ruin. The air moved with the heat of an enormous city that had burned long enough to weary even flame. The boy in the white cloak who had been made a knight in spite settled his blade against his shoulder, because there are gestures a man learns to make look effortless when he has trained long enough. "Father," Jaime said. "Sir Jaime," Lord Tywin said. as one acknowledges a junior whose work has pleased one in certain respects and disappointed in others. His gaze moved past the blade and the boy to the huddled man with the crown that would not sit straight. He regarded the king for the length of one calm breath, and then lifted his gloved hand. The men behind him did not lift weapons at once. They had the look of men who were accustomed to being told exactly how to hold an arm and when to hold it. "Alive," Tywin said, not loudly, and the shape of the day reconfigured itself like pins pattered on a map. "By a master of supplies. No marks, if that can be managed. Sir Jaime, you will lower your sword." Jaime did not move. He had not disobeyed his father in a room full of steel, since he had learned what steel felt like when it cuts. He did not move now. It was educational to discover how many parts of the body could seem to hold breath. The men behind Lord Tywin did not wait for him to finish a thought. They moved, because that is what men do when a hand like Tywin's lifts, and the room filled with them. Polite, efficient, inexorable. The king screamed once as hands took him and bound his wrists. It sounded like a small animal in a trap, and did not harmonize with the grandeur of kingship at all. Perhaps it never had. The men were careful. They had been told to be. No marks, if it can be managed. The world had moved a step from burning to bargaining. The boy in the white cloak did not lower his sword, not just yet. He stood with it, and discovered that one set of instructions written in his bones could overpower another if the ink were newly laid. He had not killed his king. No one in the room thanked him for that. There are some chores a man does to keep himself a man. The only thanks they give is that the man continues to know his own name when he is alone. Lord Tywin looked over the men's heads at his son a long moment. In his gaze was nothing like pride. There was a hard arithmetic, a counting of lives gone to ash and positions gained, a measuring of what a live king was worth compared with a dead one. There was also, very faintly, a disappointment that might mean anything at all, and therefore meant too much. He shifted his weight, and the plates of his half-armor spoke softly of order and oil. "You have done your duty," he said. It might have been praise. It might have been a reprimand. It might have been nothing. Jaime lowered his blade. He found that his hand shook and made it stop. The white cloak dragged the floor when he turned to follow where they led the king. It had never felt so heavy. He had never felt so light, as if the thing that weighted him were not cloth, but a decision already made and stored somewhere behind the heart, where the body keeps its private ledgers. They brought the king out into the ruined morning. The city lay like a patient after a fever. Shivering, exhausted, smudged with its own sweat. Smoke had scrawled a script over the rooftops that no one would ever read twice the same way. The sept was diminished, though the stones of it still insisted on being stones even when argument had been made in green. Streets went where no streets had gone yesterday. In places there were canals of ash, and in others ridges that had not been planned by any surveyor. Men, when they met one another, looked like strangers even if they had shared bread a week before, because their faces bore the same dust and the same mad astonishment. Children looked like children until they opened their mouths, and then they looked like history. They took the king along the terrace of the old kitchens past a dead cook, with a ladle still in his hand, as if he had been about to serve a last portion to a last lord. They took him down the broad stair where brides had climbed in happier reigns, and through a courtyard where a fountain had boiled and then cracked, and now trickled in sullen drips. The men were careful because they had been told to be. The big man with the straw hair was not in this party. He had been sent elsewhere to be useful in a way he enjoyed. At the base of the steps, a man with a clean bandage under his collar and dried blood on his cheek took one look at the king and spat on the stones. Another man cuffed him, and he went about his business with a sullen mutter. The eunuch emerged from a shadow like an idea someone had almost forgotten and bowed less deep than he had bowed yesterday. Pycelle had found a place to be where he might be seen aiding those who would win. He scuttled to it now with a physician's air, peering at the king's wrists and clucking as if the patient had done something foolish with his diet. None of it mattered in the way the first bright stroke of a sword mattered, or the first jar's ignition had mattered. And yet the world is made of these not matterings, small and constant as breath. The yard beyond held horses, The good ones kept back from the first storm, their flanks heaving, their eyes rolling white in a way that made them look like bad statues. Lord Tywin swung up with the grace of a man who has always climbed from ground to a thing that will bear him. He did not look behind him to see if his son followed. He did not need to. Jaime went because gravity exists and pulls in its direction every time, and because the iron chain about his shoulders had been hammered out of words and pride and needed not arms to drag him. He looked back once. The Red Keep rose over them, hacked and bruised and stubborn. The Green had licked it and found little to please its tongue. Men had done more damage here than fire had. His gaze climbed from the scuffed stones to the windows where small fires still flared like thoughts a dying man does not wish to have. He thought of the boy he had been when he had first climbed those steps under another sky. The way awe had stretched his face like a tight glove. He did not know whether to pity or despise that boy. He chose neither and turned away. On the outer slopes, the city reeked of old fish and new deaths and something sweet that had no proper name. The people had begun to come out again, because they must. They stood in knots, rubbing ash on themselves that did not wash off when they wept, and watched their king pass with a dullness that felt like rest and not like hate. A woman spat. A man fell to his knees and prayed to a god who had not provided forewarning. A child reached with both hands and then hid his face. The crowd did not surge. It did not even murmur. It had been taught silence for a few hours and was not ready to make noise again. They carried Eris to the great gate and through it and into the court beyond where the banners of the lion and the stag would soon enough stand offended at the same height, quarreling with the same wind. Somewhere behind walls and smoke, men were speaking names. Of Tywin, of Robert, of Eddard, and attaching to each name the words must and will and shall not, building with breath the scaffolds of what would be law by sundown. The king looked very small when they put him on a horse that was used to bearing heavier loads. "Sir," he said once, almost conversationally, as if he looked forward to the mild argument that might ensue about a moat, or a levy, or a war in a far province. "Sir Jaime." "I am here," Jaime said, and placed his hand on the bridle as if that hand could guide a morning. The king smiled at him, an astonishing, ordinary smile that lit the skull beneath for a moment and let a man look out. "I did not burn you," he said, and then giggled, and the smile went away into smoke. "Do you not love me for it?" Jaime stood and held the bridle and watched the men who had become his keepers, become his jailers, and felt the world choose a path it would pretend had been inevitable. He had not killed his king. The words composed themselves in him like a prayer, and he tasted them. And they were bitter, and they were also, unexpectedly, a kind of clean. He did not know yet for whom he had kept the man alive. He suspected that none of the answers would be noble. He had learned enough today about nobility to satisfy him for a decade. The green behind him thinned to gray, and the gray to a soot-colored blue. The day put its pale hand to the city's brow, as if to test for fever, and found one, and resolved to go on anyway, because day is stubborn where men are not. Jaime thought of the hand in the passages, and of the wick, and the staff, and what might have been if he had made another choice for his own hand. He thought of his father's eyes when they had met his and not glanced aside to the king at once. He thought of a sister whose hair had come down like a curtain the night the white cloak had been looped over his shoulders, and of the hollow where a boy's pride had been and was not now. He thought of a river, far off, reddened once, and of a rock nearer, that had learned how to count by tallying defeats suffered by other men. He stood. He was 19. His back hurt, as if a small man stood on it. The white cloak weighed what it had weighed before, and would weigh the same tomorrow. Somewhere men were galloping, and elsewhere men were dying in rooms no one would enter after the fires went out. And on an island, a woman looked at the sea, and decided whether to pray or to pack. The king breathed at the end of the reins. It was a thin, whistling breath with a catch. It was, like his smile had been, a human thing. Unbeautiful and unadorned. The sort of thing a man is sworn to guard even when it should be obvious to him that it will not be worth what it costs. "Come," Lord Tywin said, and the sound had the clarity of a blade drawn slow and silent inside a scabbard that knew well the feel of it. "There is much to be arranged. There was. There always is, after a city burns. Between the first counting and the second. And in that space where men add and subtract with new chalk on old slates, a boy in a white cloak walked beside a mad king's horse and told himself, with a steadiness that surprised him, that a day's work had been done. He did not think yet about what the work had bought. He would have time enough for that when the day ended and the next began, which it would, which they do, regardless of burnings, regardless of vows. He kept his hand on the bridle and let the animal's small twitchings speak into his palm. Behind them the green refused, stubbornly, to be only destruction. In places it had burned out the rot of alleys and left a harsh, clean line where new stones might one day be set. In places it had licked away old sins, as if sins were varnish and not grain in the wood. In places it had merely blackened what had already been black, and made the blackness new. The city would carry its scars and call them weather. The people would clip their children's hair close and tell them how to run when the smell was wrong. Men would say, in 100 tones, nobody could regulate who had done what, and by the end of a season the story would have a shape, and men would pretend it had always had that shape. But for now there was only this, a white cloak dusty to gray, a boy under it who had declined one sort of fame and accepted another, a king alive who would have been dead if vows meant less to one 19-year-old than his own stomach meant to him, a father who made lists. He would be a knight tomorrow and across 1,000 tomorrows, and he would not kill his king again in those days. And that too would matter, here and there, in small and then in greater ways, as waves matter when they have failed to be stopped by a wall someone thought would stop them. He would find out at leisure what kinds of men come to take advantage, or get broken when a realm decides it has survived, and calls survival peace. They rode on, and the city stared, and the sun labored up past the ropes of smoke as if dragging a net. No one was ready for the judgment of the light. They stood in it anyway. A bell somewhere began again, an uncertain tapping, as if a child had found a stick and wanted to know what sound wood made. Jaime counted the strikes without meaning to, lost the count, and began again. He had time. The day had made him a man with more time than he had the right to, and with a task he did not yet know how to do, and all of it would be measured in steps beside a horse that carried a man who had not died when he ought. And that is a thing to be used or wasted. He did not know yet which he would choose. He did not choose yet. He walked.